Welcome to Middle East Observer with me, Nicholas Richardson. As the Washington-Riyadh thaw began after Biden's visit, Mohammed bin Salman went to Greece, where the Saudi leader was greeted very warmly. Athens, which has always lived in the shadow of Ankara, appreciates that both NATO and the Saudis are finally empowering the Greeks at the expense of the Turks. During July's visit to Ankara, Mohammed bin Salman told Erdogan to withdraw from his aggressive policy towards Greece and Cyprus. Later, after what was a compromising NATO summit in Madrid for the Turkish president, Congress approved the sale of F-35 fighters to the Greeks and maintained a ban on the export of aircraft to Turkey. During the meeting with Greek Prime Minister Christos Mitsotakis, Mohammed bin Salman confirmed that Saudi and Gulf money, in cooperation with Middle Eastern and European partners, wants to connect Europe and the Middle East via the Mediterranean Sea with a transmission network. In the Saudi plans, Greece would be the hub in southern Europe through which the raw materials needed today and in the future are to pass. Thus, it is a return to the concept of 15 years ago, but this time neither Berlin nor Ankara are included in the Saudi plans. This shows another failure of Berlin's policy, which over the years has been doing multi-billion-dollar deals with Turkey and Iran, turning a blind eye to the persecution of women, ethnic and religious minorities, as well as the political opposition and even public executions of Iranian homosexuals. The Germans never had such understanding for the Arab countries of the Gulf. Mohammed bin Salman went to Paris, which the presidents of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Mohammed bin Zayed, as well as the Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, had recently visited. All these politicians are united by the great project of natural gas from the Mediterranean area entering the European Union market and the connection of the Persian Gulf with Europe. Anyway, it is Paris, not Berlin, that is starting to be the heart of the EU from the Middle East perspective. The Middle East media seldom comment on the spectre of the energy crisis which Germany is facing. Besides, German politicians are not taking any steps towards the Gulf. On the other hand, France is a traditional counterweight to the United States, and the Saudis want, through Paris, to protect themselves against the spectre of another political upheaval in Washington, which is possible if the radical left comes to influence American foreign policy. And even the French media consciously pointed out that now the reality that the Persian Gulf was striving for, business and politics itself, and not ideological pressure from the West, has come. Mohammed bin Salman talked with Macron about energy issues, the war in Ukraine and Iran, and Lebanon, in which a direct confrontation between pro-Iranian and therefore pro-Russian Hezbollah and Israel over the disputed gas reservoirs could take place. Moscow is using pro-Iranian assets in the region to deter or limit this interest. Macron was to complain to MBS about Algeria, which is being taken over by Russia, from which France buys a large part of its oil and gas. Moreover, Russian expansion in the African continent worries both Paris and Riyadh. France is afraid of losing African deposits of raw materials and the spectre of another artificial migration crisis caused by Russia. The Saudis are concerned that with the Russians there is chaos throughout which, in African Muslim areas, Iran supports radical Islamists who are traditionally opposed to the Saudis. Moreover, the French media announced that the next foreign MBS trip will go on is to Algeria, which is Iran's traditional ally. And now, to discuss these issues, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by my guest, Kasper Kita, from the think tank Novi Wad. Kasper, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Nicholas. Thanks for having me.
And, of course, Paris is becoming very important in the Middle East. We've had recently visits of the presidents of Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, the Prime Minister of Israel, and, of course, the big one, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Why are the doors to the Élysée Palace so wide open to Middle East influence today?
Well, I think that the French have been trying to be an important power in the Middle East for centuries. Obviously, we remember Napoleon's visit to Egypt, his fight with Admiral Nelson, and his rivalry with the British. Then we had French colonial settlements, colonial ambitions, and now we have the so-called Arab policy that has been put in place by General de Gaulle back in the 60s. And basically, the French assumption is that the Americans, as the main ally of Israel, and and the British as a former colonial power are not universally liked in all Arab and Muslim countries, and therefore France should have a more balanced policy and present itself as the more reasonable, pragmatic partner that is not that pro-Israel, that with most of these countries doesn't have this historical entanglements. Though obviously France is also a colonial power, but in other countries, less so in the Middle East, and therefore. When now we had this situation where Mohammed bin Salman was not welcome in European capitals after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi back in 2018, President Macron decided that once again this is an opportunity for France to present itself as the most pragmatic of big European countries. And therefore Macron was the first big Western leader to visit Riyadh, to visit Saudi Arabia back at the end of last year. And now we had the revisit of Mohammed bin Salman, and we see that Macron saw that this will happen anyway, like President Joe Biden, who was very critical of Saudi Arabia during his presidential campaign, now has also decided that, well, the political reality is that Mohammed bin Salman will be the ruler of Saudi Arabia. And he visited Riyadh last month. But Macron was first, and now we had a revisit by bin Salman. And when we're talking about Egypt, which also has good relations with Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, which have very good relations with Saudi Arabia, I think that France wants to present itself at the same time as a country that is pragmatic, as I've already said, but also as a country which develops ties with these countries, with this axis of countries that are skeptical of Iran and its regional ambitions. We see that Iran is absent of these from these meetings. Macron would like to be a mediator, to be a balancing power in the Middle East, at the same way he would like France to be a balancing power in Eastern Europe, as he tried before the war. He had an idea that he would help, for example, to negotiate a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or a revisioned nuclear deal with Iran that would include Saudi Arabia, but these ideas so far have not been put to action because obviously of tensions between these Middle Eastern countries.
Yes, now one puzzling absence perhaps from all of this is Germany, which is of course a major, perhaps some would say the major European Union country, which seems to be quite happy to stand aside while France and the Middle East engage in these games, you might say. I mean, why is Germany so happy to stand aside? And to the extent that Germany is standing aside, in the context of what's going on in the Middle East, is there a potential role for Poland?
Well, I think that Germany is. Germany has had these traditional allies in the Middle East that were Turkey and Iran, and at the moment Iran is isolated, and Turkey is trying to emerge from its former isolation by rebuilding its ties with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with the United States. I think that we have this division between, sort of division of roles between France and Germany that's been going on for over 100 years. You know, after Germany won the rivalry for domination in Europe over France back in around 1870, obviously since this moment Germany has overcome the former French domination of Central Europe, and therefore Germany emerged as the country number one in Europe. I think that the French have been reacting to this loss, to Waterloo, to Sedan, by trying to build a colonial empire or some other its influence, general influence in Africa and in the Middle East. Some French commentators call it sort of, you know, an empire of compensation. And I think that that Germany now has less assets than France in the Middle East, though obviously Germany has much more assets in Europe than France. And also Germany has a new government that has its internal problems, that is the least that is the most diverse, politically speaking, government in Germany since the Second World War, because we have three different parties, and neither of which has a majority over the other two. And also, I think the Germans are more dependent on Russia than the French, and therefore they are more concentrated on the war, because they can suffer more from the war in Ukraine.
Yes. Now, according to, I mean, it's really obvious that there's a great rivalry nowadays in most parts of the world, including the Middle East, between the United States and China. On the other hand, France has been, and the United States has been very critical, particularly of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, over human rights issues. And we think of the murder, as you mentioned earlier, of the journalist in the Turkish consulate, Saudi Arabian Turkish consulate. We think of the war in Yemen, where France has been sort of very understanding of if I may put it like that, of the Saudi position. Do you think France, therefore, is the country which is like to be able to lead, if you like, a resurgence of Western influence in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East?
Perhaps. I think that the French would like, and it's also a Gaullist tradition, would like to see themselves as a country that is at the same time obviously a Western country, allied with the US, with NATO, etc., but is also a power in itself, because obviously France with the Americans and the British are the only nuclear powers in NATO, in the West, and therefore very relatively independent in the security issues from the Americans, and I think the French have been trying to present themselves as a player that is allied but independent, and they have been conducting this policy regarding Russia, regarding Soviet Union back during the Cold War, and when at the same time they were engaged, for example, in helping Germans during the Berlin crisis, but at the same time they would try to develop their own channels with the Soviets. And I think in the Middle East it's the same now. They want to be seen as a country that is less concerned with human rights issues than the United States, in terms of Yemen, in terms of Khashoggi, or for example, we've talked about Germany. Germany has decided to stop sending arms to Saudi Arabia some time ago because of the war in Yemen, but the French didn't. I think that, but at the same time, they are also trying to present themselves as a more understanding towards Iran than the Americans, or towards other countries that are maligned by the West. So I think yes, the French are often seen as a country that's not 100% loyal ally of the Western countries of NATO, for example, that always wants to be independent. But I think yes, because of that, they are creating some room to rebuilding of Western influence in the Middle East or in Africa. Because a few weeks ago Macron was in Africa, and there he was obviously there to battle Russian and Chinese influence there.
It's been fascinating. I'm sorry, as usual, we've been defeated by the clock, but thank you very much indeed, Caspar.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. There we have it, defeated by the clock, but I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Very interesting chat with Caspar, as always. Look forward to having him back on the programme in the future, and look forward. Caspar, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating insight. Alas, we've been defeated by the clock, but that's always the case. Do come and join us again.
I sure will. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much indeed. There we have it, defeated by the clock as always. But that's been a fascinating discussion, always is with Casper. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Middle East Observer.